So I had time this weekend because my part of the UK is probably definitely heading into second lockdown. So I kind of took this weekend to do some last minute panicking, and I watched Ryan Murphy's latest venture on his never ending train of production. Seriously, how does he make so much? I'd like to know how. Well, so on his never-ending train of production, his latest venture is on Netflix. Ratched, the prequel to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, looking at Nurse Ratched and how she got to this point. Essentially, taking the perspective of what if Nurse Ratched was a serial killer? Woo! Which I don't know, Ryan Murphy. What if my grandmother had wheels? Would she be a bicycle? Like, I know that it's very cliche to complain that Hollywood has the trend of making prequels and like looking at what's already out there at established media and thinking like, how can I make something that ties into this? How can I profit off this already profitable named property? Which most of the time I think is kind of a bad take, because that's kind of what Hollywood's always done. I've been watching a lot of silent and classic cinema, and you would be amazed how much of that is just based on something someone else has done. Like, a lot of it is like adaptations and remakes. So yeah, I don't dislike it based on that, and I don't think it's inherently disinteresting to look at a character like Nurse Ratched and the context of mental health care in the 1960s and 1950s. I don't think it's I don't think it's uninteresting to consider her perspective, her point of view, how she ended up in that place. But the show is just, it's very, very boring. What if bad person was actually serial killer, but also empowered feminist serial killer? So the plot line of this show is that Mildred Ratched in 1947 is just starting out her career of a grand scheme of running a Oregon mental health facility in a very controlling way, and she starts in California by faking credentials to a fake doctor, Dr. Hanover, who is addicted to laughing gas or some drug that's inhaled in a clear blue velvet homage, and he's working there because he cut off all the limbs of a patient in an LSD frenzy, which is not how LSD works, and the patient's mother, Sharon Stone, is hunting him down. Ratched wants to work at this facility because her adoptive brother, who is a serial killer who killed 4 priests, is working there. He enters into a relationship with a slutty nurse because all the nurses are slutty. Such feminism. And I'm struggling just to comprehend all of this. And there's a governor who wants to execute him because his re-election for governorship is based on people caring about the fight against mental illness in 1947, and his secretary is liaising with the hospital and is Mildred's love interest, and Sharon Stone hires a detective to kill Dr. Hanover, and then they Ratched and Hanover kill the detective, and then they're in this scheme, and it's like this ball is in the air of who's going to kill her adoptive brother Edmund, the state or whatever. It's like everyone's scheming against everyone else, and then in typical Ryan Murphy fashion, a bunch of the extraneous characters are just murdered off, and then it somehow ends on a relatively happy ending, because all his shows do, because he's a hack. Okay, so I'm gonna sort of consider Ratched in the internet approved form of a list. Things that I noticed as I spent 8 hours watching this and thinking, why? So I guess the first thing coming into this is sort of the stylization of Ratched. I think I was watching it with Coralia, and it's very pretty. It's a gorgeous show. The costume design is stunning. It's very classic New Look Dior of the 1940s, when American and European fashion houses that weren't as restricted by wartime restrictions really suddenly went woomph with fashion, because now they had the ability to, because rationing was over for some and the war was over. So you get these beautiful sweeping Dior New Look costumes. It's all in Technicolor. Everything's very brightly coloured. There's so much. The filming and directing style, a lot of people have said that it's very Hitchcockian. It's sort of that 1950s noir melodrama combined with like 1950s B-movie sort of colour aesthetics. To me, watching it, I found a lot of Stanley Kubrick in it, because there's a lot of wide shots, lots of spaces, lots of long corridors accentuating how people are, feeling and their looks, lots of patterns. The setting, the mental health facility that it takes place in, mostly set in California, reminds me a lot of the Overlook Hotel. So very much in that style of 1940s, 1950s noir, which is very pretty. Like, there's a lot of effort. You look at this mental health hospital and you think, wow, considering they're always saying this hospital's underfunded, we need more funding from the state, and you're like, wow, maybe if you fired all your interior designers, then you would have a lot more money, because this place is spotless and gorgeous and gigantic and looks like a hotel. It doesn't look like any mental health facility I've been to or seen. You wanna save some money? Get rid of all those fucking high ceilings. And that's one of the first initial problems you have coming into Ratched, because you know that it's a prequel to a piece of established media, and it does not match up with that piece of established media, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But when you look at One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Milos Forman, the director wanted to go for a really strict feeling of naturalism and realism when he shot the film. So it is shot on location in an Oregon facility. Mental health patients were extras. There was a lot of performers, the chief in particular, who were not actors. They were just normal people. Forman and the cast lived in the hospital. They watched procedures being done. He wanted it to feel as natural as possible, so he often just left the cameras running to sort of catch the reactions of the cast when they weren't, on, and a lot of that ended up in the film. And knowing that, and then you watch Ratched, which is so stylized and so beautiful, it makes you step back, because the point of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the author's intentions aside, is really shining a light on the treatment and sort of the capitalist nature of society, how it chews, the combine, which is a concept in the book, chewing people up, this machine that chews people up and spits them out and only takes what's worth, what their society values from them, and then kicking out other people that don't match up to it. And you get that sense with the movie, as much as the author didn't like the movie, this is something that is so commonplace as to be unnoticed by society and to really immerse you in this place. And then you watch Ratched, and it feels like Ryan Murphy watched Shock Treatment, the really underrated sequel to Rocky Horror Picture Show, wrote like a prequel for that, and then Evan Romansky, the guy who came up with Ratched, who wrote the pilot, he read that script and was like, oh great, let me sellotape these two things together, because they clearly go, I can have lots of women be catty in gorgeous period outfits at each other in this setting. One Flew works because the realism makes it shocking, almost as if you're watching a documentary, as if this is something that happened, this is something that could happen to you. And then you watch Ratched, and it's this Technicolor noir B-movie horror film from the 50s, and that in itself is fine. If it was an original property set up like that, I would like it a lot more. But because it's set in this really specific timeline and world, it's just like, what? How does this become what I know it's going to become? This world doesn't make any sense. This is strange. It runs on fantasy nonsense logic, which is fine, but if you're going to run on fantasy nonsense logic, it should be in service of a franchise that runs on fantasy nonsense logic. What does it say about how we treat the disabled? Because the author of the original book based it on his real life experiences. He worked as an orderly in a mental health facility, and a lot of the patients in the book, Nurse Ratched herself, is based on people that he knew. So suddenly that's turned into monkeys in dresses, a guy having his skin boiled off, being stabbed with pitchforks. Sure? And I guess that leads into my second point, which is the really specific context of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And it's been a while since I've done history of sort of the treatment of insanity in mental health. I did a bit of it at university, primarily based on UK systems, where you look at the wider context. You've got at the start, late 18th century, 19th century, you've got sort of naturalism and moral and spiritual kind of cures. You get a lot of Quakers who run what were then known as asylums, trying to get people out back in nature, reconnecting them with their moral, spiritual natures to heal them. And then as the 19th century progresses, you've got a more sort of medical viewpoint of mental illness, but then also how it's again, it's still a moral failing. You can tell who's going to be morally defective, but there's an idea that you can treat it with science, that you don't need God, science can work, which then leads into the rise of eugenics. So you're looking at, instead of this system of curing them, to going, well, potentially curing them, to containing the mentally ill, the disabled, stopping them from breeding, and trying to cut their genes out of the gene pool, where we come into the late 1950s, early 1960s, which is the point where One Flew was written, where you're looking at deinstitutionalization, at changing the system from containing people in asylums, because that's expensive, and looking at how we can correct things with our new modern science and get people back and participating in society, whether or not that's successful or not. The world of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is our own, you're looking at mental health treatment at this point, is seeing the disabled as sort of undesirable, as unwanted, as incapable, intellectually incapable of engaging with society, engaging with their own health, engaging with how to make themselves better. So the state and nurses and doctors take that from them. So they're sort of like children. And it's not as if much things have changed. So when you look at Nurse Ratched, she's a really extreme version of this system. She is cruel. She's controlling. She literally has kind of power of life or death over these people, but it's not an extreme example, really, that this represents the culmination of a system that purposefully disenfranchises disabled people from having a say in their care, that sees them as being lesser. We know better than you about your own health. And as a disabled and mentally ill person, I've been in and out of, I have a chronic neurological condition. I've been in and out of mental health care since I was 18. And the scary thing about Nurse Ratched is how mundane she is, because as a disabled person, you are never more than one bad doctor away from having complete control taken away from you. I have had so many bad doctors. I've had doctors tell me to my face that I'm a liar, that I don't deserve pain treatment, or I don't deserve medication I need to literally function. I had a male doctor who purposefully refused to diagnose me with my chronic health condition. He told me it was a woman's complaint, and purposefully denied me tests that would have seen me get treatment. A woman's problem, my fucking ass. My brain sticks out the back of my skull. Thanks for not noticing. And that's, to me, that's what Nurse Ratched represents. The ultimate culmination of a person who believes that they're doing the right thing, that they care for you, but they know better than you, because as a disabled person, you're kind of like less on the scale, you know, you're less deserving of respect. You know, if they see you again in the doctor's office, you know, why the fuck are you here again? Why are you always complaining? And that's what makes her scary. Any person you talk to with a mental health condition, chronic health condition, will tell you that they have met a nurse or a doctor who has purposefully disbelieved them or denied them treatment or just won't listen to them. It's happened to so many people I know, and that's the scary thing. I think that's what makes Nurse Ratched really scary, is that there are people like that, and she isn't this grand, you know, villain. She's someone, I think I was reading Louise Fletcher, the actress who played her, the original Mildred Ratched, and she says that she's someone who cares, but she's got to the point where she has so much power over people that she can't tell what she's doing is good or bad. It's just a reflection of how society views the disabled, that they are less than human, that we're subhuman. I can tell that a lot of people who were not disabled worked on this show, because that in itself isn't scary to them. They don't go, wow, society hates the disabled, it's one of the most common prejudices there is, that's the scary thing. They're like, no, there has to be a reason why she's bad to people. And I'm like, she's bad to them because she has the power over them and she thinks that she knows what she's doing is best for them. That's the scary thing. Nurse Ratched is just a nurse. Like, she's just a normal person. Her and the orderlies, her and the other nurses are cruel, but they're not cruel because they're sociopaths. They're cruel because they're in a position where each day they've had a little bit more power, they've had a little bit more say over people's lives, and they've reached a point where they can't recognise whether they're doing right or wrong, because they presume that they're doing right, because no one's stopping them, no one's telling them to do anything else. Society, in the wider scheme of things, doesn't care about the people in their care. They're the only people who truly care, and you move a little bit each day until you're so far from the point that you started, you don't recognise what you're doing. And there's no doubt that one flew over the cuckoo's nest has really shaped how we view the mentally ill and the treatment of the mentally ill. I mean, like, it's been 50 years, almost 60 years since that, 1962. It's been 60 years, essentially, since it was published, and it's still referenced endlessly in media about the mentally ill. And whether or not that's a positive or negative thing, I think is a bit up in the air. It is reflective of the period in which it was created, and I don't think it... It's my cat. It's reflective of the period in which it was created, and I don't think it represents, realistically, the face of mental health care today. Whether or not, you can assess whether it's had a positive or negative impact, but it sought to address the issue of how we think about the disabled, how we think about that care, to say, hey, shutting people away, locking them away, relying on treatments that keep them sedated and calm and controlled are not necessarily treatments that are in the best interests of the people that they are being done to. Are you listening to their viewpoints? Are you taking into account their needs? How are we getting people from a point where they're ill to where they feel that they can function? And it does reflect a real lived experience. And watching this show, I was very insulted. Not in like an I'm offended way, but I could tell that no one who had my experiences, no one who had more in-depth experiences of mental health treatment worked on this show. And people can say, well, it's meant to be an extreme example of like this kind of treatment is an extreme example of the mentally ill, and I'm like, fine, I guess. I can tell that it's like crazy people on TV because obviously they have someone with multiple personality disorders. Everyone's a murderer. Everyone's like sexually deranged. And I'm like, Okay. It's based on a work that presented real life experiences, but sure, let's have a queer guy who goes crazy and stabs people with pins and then like loses his fucking mind and chops his limbs off while he's high on LSD. Sure. I felt that every person they chose to depict with a mental health problem was just a very Hollywood stereotypy version. It felt grossly insulting in a way that wasn't fun for me to watch, because they're boring, hackneyed stereotypes in the first place, and then you're just replicating them without questioning why they are hurtful, harmful, and why the original work did not depict them. And, like, I can't stress enough how insulting it is to have a show which is ostensibly about the prejudice and the hatred you face as a disabled person, as a mentally ill person, and the people who create it cannot comprehend why people hate the disabled. Every character has this like grand scheming backstory about like all these soap opera elements about why they're cruel to the disabled or why they, recognise their humanity, and like it's very grand and sweeping, and I'm like, there doesn't need to be a grand reason for the prejudice, because it's fucking there. It's there in every single day that I live. It's there in the lives of nearly every single disabled person that I know. There's no grand reason why people don't like people like me. They just don't. I find it insulting when abled people are like, why do people dislike the disabled? It must be because of all these grand, tragic backstory reasons, instead of some people are dicks, and we live in a society where people like me are considered subhuman in a fashion. The show takes place in an age where eugenics was literally the policy of the state. There doesn't need to be all these like very florid reasons why Mildred Ratched wants to take away the pain of the disabled. She lives in a society where eugenics is open, believed in, and considered normal. If this was any other show representing any other franchise, I wouldn't be asking for like complete and utter by the book realism. But this is a show that is based ostensibly on a man's real life response to working in the mental health system. Yeah, you don't need to try and answer why ableism. And every disabled person was... I mean, that's not fair. Every person on the show is morally bankrupt, horrible, awful people, but the disabled ones were especially bad. We've got giggling amputee boy who's crazy and just wants to kill people. Great. Sophie Okonedo as the most stereotypical depiction of multiple personality disorder. She kills people and takes their identities because she's crazy. And the woman who works at the motel, who uses leeches, thinks she's an alcoholic flapper, and she's just crazy. They're just there. You're not gonna look at how they were treated, societal attitudes towards their treatment, maybe explore the idea of living with these conditions in that time frame, how that would have been, how that affect your mental health, your psychology. None of that. Nope. They're just crazy psycho murderers because this is a Ryan Murphy production, and, while he wrote American Horror Story Asylum, which was his most cohesive season of American Horror Story, let's be fair, and really did, I think, explore the idea, the eugenical underpinnings of mental health treatment of the 20th century, because they had a literal Nazi on staff, the dismissal, the disrespect, the way that mentally ill people and disabled people were treated as children and had all decisions and rights taken from them. That show can manage to tap into all those ideas. And yet, again, we're left with yet another Ryan Murphy show, which is 8 hours of crazy psycho murderers just murdering for no good reason. Okay. Cool. Point I. Mildred Ratched is a serial killer now. I don't necessarily dislike the idea of prequels and established universes because it really encourages people to recontextualise or re-look at established work through a different lens. And I think there is something to be said about looking at how a character like Mildred Ratched was formed to look at the societal attitudes of the disabled, to look at her experiences as a combat medic, to see how that would shape the person she becomes. Like, I think that could legitimately be something interesting if it was, like, confined to, like, 2 hours maybe, not 8 hours. Because in this show, Sarah Paulson as Nurse Ratched starts episode 1 as an all-powerful serial killer who can, dress anyone down. She can talk anyone into anything. She's already killed, like, a ton of people. And, like, so that's where she is in episode 1. And it stays exactly the same. She's just an all-powerful supervillain serial killer because that's interesting. I mean, I love seeing no character growth and no change, and I love it when a character is just all-powerful and does everything right the first time and gets whatever they want and faces no consequences or actions. I love it. What does it add to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest to be like Mildred Ratched was an all-powerful serial killer? Like, she doesn't even kill people she doesn't kill people in the book or the film. She's cruel. She essentially talks Billy into suicide. She lobotomizes people. Well, orders it done. In this show, she's just like, yep, let me just grab a screwdriver and I'll just do it on the fly. What does that add? What more do I learn about her and the society that created her? If she starts out being the person that we know she's going to be, allegedly, why am I watching this? What growth is there? She doesn't change. And let's look at the reasons why she's such a terrible, awful, controlly person, even though she's relatively normal in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Let's talk about her backstory on this show. She doesn't just have one backstory. She has the backstory of about 20 different people. Because you see, she was the illegitimate child of an alcoholic during the Depression. She was beaten by her mum and thrown out. Then she got into the foster system and was beaten by every foster parent. Then she was matched up with a boy named Edmund and they were both beaten. And then they were adopted by a family who also ran a child sex trafficking ring. So she was forced to have sex with her sort of pseudo-brother. And then, she ran away after he murdered their foster parents. And then she faked her credentials to be a combat medic so that she could be an angel of mercy for soldiers and kill them. Then she was found out and she's a repressed lesbian. Men try to rape her and her brother then becomes even more of a serial killer when he kills 4 priests and okay. What does any of that add to Mildred Ratched? So you've got the original film and book version she's just a nurse. She's just a nurse who's very cruel. And then you've got the Ratched version where she is apparently the victim of every single crime ever and just trauma after trauma after trauma. The trauma conga line never gave up for Mildred Ratched, and now she's at this point where she's both gleefully happy a serial killer but also sad because her brother's a serial killer who molested her and she's also a victim of child sex trafficking, abuse, abandonment, and Why? There doesn't need to be a reason why Nurse Ratched is the way she is. She's the way she is because that's how society encouraged her to behave. Like, it's just, she has so much backstory. It's like, let's give her all the trauma in the world, only we're not really going to explore it. She's just going to reveal it in lengthy monologues and like a puppet show backstory segment, and then it will get even worse because she falls in love with a lesbian who she thinks is deviant, and then like they get together, but then the lesbian has breast cancer now. And her adoptive brother is a serial killer who murdered 4 nuns who she won't let love people but also wants to fuck her, and it's all too much. It's so ridiculous. Whenever I see things like this happen, I think of that Jurassic Park quote by Ian Malcolm. You know, you were so busy thinking that you could, you didn't stop to think whether you should. From what I understand, it's Evan Romansky was in a film school or was just starting out and the script got noticed by Ryan Murphy, and yeah, that holds up. That someone's come up with that is not experienced in storytelling, and Ryan Murphy, who should know better than this, considering the sheer amount of stuff that he puts out, was like, yeah, and let me add just my extra magic to this. Why? What does it add? Do I get any more understanding of Nurse Ratched by watching this show? No. If I was to watch this show on this own, would I feel satisfied in the story development? Does it have a successful beginning, middle and end? Do I feel that this character, do I engage with her, see her grow and change? No. She's pretty much exactly the same person as she is at the start of the show as she is at the end. Just a very traumatised abuse victim who likes to kill people. Great. Awards all round. It is the best of writing. She is the perfect serial killer with so many powers. She's just like a supervillain. She's like Kilgrave from Jessica Jones. She can talk people into doing anything. Isn't that amazingly powerful? And something, and aren't you happy as a viewer that she can just do that from the first episode and we don't see her grow and improve? Oh no, wait. She gets the girlfriend at the end, and now the mental health hospital is now run by women, so I guess the conclusion to this show is female empowerment. I feel very empowered that this serial killer is happy now, I guess. So, point 5. Point V. End of points. Last point. Just a general complaints about whatever I found really annoying. Everyone talks like a video game NPC. I say that, I don't know whether other people say this, I say this about shows where, you know when you play Skyrim or like Fallout or, you know, Dragon Age, one of these grand voiced RPGs, and you walk up to a character and they're like, "Hi, I'm Edmund the Blacksmith. My wife was murdered by the Imperium. Her necklace, which holds the essence of her spirit and which is very dear to me, is held in the camp over there. Would you go get this for me?" You know, you meet them and they just dump all the important motivation information about them, like all the stuff that you need to know to be like, "Oh cool, I've got the quest, I can go." And that is how everyone talks in Ratched. Like, Mildred is like, "Hello," and they're like, "Bleh! Here's my entire life story and my backstory and my motivations." Just, the audience couldn't infer any of this by the way I act or by my dialogue. Let me just tell you directly the person I am, the things I want to achieve, and my motivation. So I remember there's one scene where she's talking to one of the slutty nurses, and she just tells her in detail her masturbation fantasies and why she wants to fuck serial killers, and you're like, okay. Why? Why are you telling her this? Everyone's just like, "Hello, I'm Dr. Hanover. I cut people's limbs off in an LSD fantasy because that's how LSD works, and I feel guilty about it." And I'm like, speaks like this? Who grandly announces their entire life goals to someone? No one speaks like this. It's a very stilted way of speaking that threw me right out, because I suppose, great, I'm getting like this huge info dump on who these people are, but that just tells me that you couldn't be bothered to naturally incorporate it into the script through the way that they behave. You just had to tell me, because I, a member of the audience, cannot be trusted to understand what's going on, obviously. Two things which I think are typically Ryan Murphy, in that he sort of has these grand plots and then he sort of like loses enthusiasm halfway through and then tries to wrap it up. So everyone's motivations for what they are doing constantly change. I was watching the whole show and I had no idea what people wanted, why they were doing anything. One episode they were like, I will not do this, I will not do that, and the next episode they're like, here I am, cutting limbs off, stabbing people, shooting people, I don't care. Why? They're doing these things because the plot says so, not because there's an organic reason for them to get to this point. There's an overarching plot that's been put down, and they're like, character A has to go to plotline Z, so even though they stated when they met Mildred Ratched their exact life purpose being contrary to like endpoint Z, we've got to get them there, so we'll just change how they think and how they act and what they want, because it doesn't matter. Okay, I can't keep track of what everyone's backstabbing everybody the whole time, and I can't keep track of what people want, but cool. I don't need to use my brain, I don't need to think or be satisfied by a story, it's fine, it can just end. And in addition to that, Ryan Murphy likes to create characters. It's unfair to me to lay it totally on him, but unfortunately, I would say that the other guy and the other writers did it, but I see this in all of Ryan Murphy's works, so what am I going to do? He likes to create lots of characters. You see it in Horror Story, in Crime Story. When Ryan Murphy comes to write something, and he's got his book, these are people I've worked with and I want to work with again, and then he's got another book, which is these are people I would like to work with, and then he looks through the books and creates characters based on that, because there are so many extraneous characters in this show that do not need to be there, and they're just there, like Sharon Stone's character who has a monkey and is an heiress, her son, the woman who runs the motel, Dr. Hanover, Nurse Betsy. They don't really contribute anything or grow or function really, and then the minute that their slim function is done, he just kills them off, or like does something horrible to them, or just is like, I guess that character vanishes. Happens for no rhyme or reason. Like Sharon Stone's character is supposedly motivated, driving the plot to kill Dr. Hanover to get revenge for her son, and then she just ends up pitchforked in the back because she didn't mean anything. The son, who was being built up as like this weird potential serial killer, just gets sent to a mental health facility by her will. Dr. Hanover just gets stabbed by a patient, and you're like, okay, I guess one didn't mean anything. If it didn't mean anything, why should I be invested? Why should I care in the story? Because you clearly don't. Finn Wittrock is back as the exact same character he was in American Horror Story Freak Show and American Horror Story Hotel. He is a serial killer who is sexy, and all the women want to have sex with him. Isn't he so sexy? And I'm like, okay, I guess. Great. There's weird stuff about race, and not that that sounds like I'm putting it weirdly, like I'm saying that the show says weird stuff about race. I mean, it doesn't say anything about race. I will credit Ryan Murphy and his production team for always trying to include more diversity than you would normally find on sort of mainstream prestige TV. However, I couldn't tell watching this whether Ratched was meant to take place in the same universe as his other Netflix show, Hollywood, or in this world and this universe, because The show is very definitively set in 1947, and apparently it's a world where segregation doesn't exist. So Cynthia Nixon's character, the lesbian who falls for Mildred Ratched, is in a lavender marriage. You know, she has a beard, she has a husband to disguise her lesbian identity. And the man she chose is a black man. And okay. If you're going to include that as a detail, you kind of maybe should think that through. Because if this is set in a realistic world of 1947, for a start, they can't have been married for several years because interracial marriage in California was illegal until 1947. The world is segregated. Well, America is segregated. It's 1947. What white lesbian is going to choose to hide her identity in, like, who goes like, I need to hide my identity as a lesbian and as a white woman I'm going to pick a man for which there will be nothing inflammatory or noticeable, something that I could lose my job for, something that will keep me definitively out of trouble. I will marry a black man. Think there's a problem there, Murphy. I think there's a problem that you've just decided to entirely overlook. You've just gone, I'm just going to do this and just brush all those difficult questions aside. That's a kettle of fish. You've just dived right in there. It's a lot of fish and you've just decided to completely ignore it. I don't know, it's not my place to say. Again, I imagine that what we don't need is yet another depiction of black people or people in colour being in pain in this year. But if you're going to set a work in a specified historical context, you have to be prepared to discuss the specific historical context. It's not enough to go, well, we don't see race. If you're going to set it in a historical context, you have to be prepared to talk about the historical context. Yeah, I guess those are some general thoughts. I mean, I'm not going about this show, it's the worst thing that I ever saw, because I tend to think that's kind of a reductive way of looking at things, to be like, this is the worst thing ever. I don't think anything is the worst, singular worst thing ever. If you can watch it and enjoy it and turn your brain off and just enjoy what is a very beautifully shot, beautifully designed show, then do it. I'm not telling you not to. If you can watch it and be completely turn your brain off, that's great. I really can't, and it was just very boring. It was the least interesting way to look at the issues that they wanted to talk about. To talk about the context of mental health care, the role of eugenics, the treatment of the disabled, the treatment of women at that time period, combat trauma, generalised trauma, like, those would all make really interesting points and beats for a character-driven show. But then they were like, hey, what if she was a serial killer? Wouldn't that be scary if she were like an angel of mercy who killed people to give them, release from what they were going through? And I'm like, that's nothing to do with the character of Nurse Ratched. What's essentially happened is that Evan Romansky, who came up with the concept, wrote a concept for a TV show. In my opinion, I mean, it could easily be wrong, but what it feels like to me is that he wrote an original show that was sort of set in a crazed mental health facility and like had all this period stuff about it, and someone said, isn't that kind of what Ryan Murphy did with American Horror Story? Then he scribbled out the names, attached it to a known franchise, sent it to Ryan Murphy, and then Ryan Murphy went, great, and then changed all the dialogue to be, can you stop scratching my shirt? To be women being catty at each other. And he was like, let's put everyone in Dior, let's make it Technicolor. let's have all my favourite older female actresses in it, and just, it's pointless. It would be much better if it was just a franchise, just a series about made up characters who had no connection to anything. From everything I've read, they've planned out a 4-season arc where every season Mildred Ratched has to face off against a man trying to like take her power away and take her control away, and I'm like, it's great. So much empowerment. I feel very empowered by that. Leading up to, I guess, a retelling of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is, no, don't let him do it. Anyone would be better. Someone needs to take his keyboard away from him. He needs a good script supervisor. Failing that, he needs someone to hover over the keyboard and slap his... No, you can't play with the mic. He needs someone standing by the keyboard and slapping his hands to make him stop. Because the boringness of it, the emptiness that is inherent within this show, I think it's because he just writes so much. You think about the amount of stuff he's done. Okay, I'll hold your hand. The amount of stuff he's done over the last 5 years, it's so many TV shows, it's so much. No one person can produce that much stuff. Alright, you're being naughty. No one person can produce that quantity of material at a level of quality, because he puts so much out, and I know that he's not writing every script, and he's probably not directly supervising everything, but there's too many hallmarks within this show for me to not say that he didn't tinker, tamper, and rewrite huge portions of the script. I'm sorry. It's got every trope, everything that he does in it, and there's only so many times you can give me the same thing over and over again, and like, I've made you this delicious fish pie, Jess. Eat it, and I've made you another one, and I've made you another one, and I've made you... There's only so many times that you can make the same thing and it have the same result or be as good as the first thing you did. So overall, I guess my conclusion would be, the show's pretty, performances are good, like, everyone's solid because they're all professionals and they're good at what they do. I doubt I'll be thinking about it in 4 months. I won't even be thinking about it at the end of the month. This is exactly what I faced with Hollywood. The minute it was over, I'd forgotten I'd watched it, because it's just a bit empty and thoughtless and has no weight. My official response would be, it's a fart on the breeze. It's hollow, it's empty, leaves a bad smell, and you'll forget you've done it within 20 minutes. Those are my thoughts on Ratched. My next video is done. It's just taking a while to edit. I make John do that in the salt mines. If you like my opinions and my face, you can subscribe down below, click the bell. You can give me money at coffee. I like money. And it is what it is. Just a fart on the breeze.